We want every young person in this country to live the life that they want to live. And for a long time, that has just not been the case. A lot of young men are turning to some quite unsavoury people and things that they see on the internet, and people who promise cheap solutions to really difficult problems that people face in their lives. But I think often that's because it feels like there isn't any hope. We will know that we've succeeded as a government where young people, young men across this country feel a real sense of hope and optimism for the future.
Lisa Nandy, Secretary of State. Why are we here today? Why are we talking about International Men's Day?
Because as a government we feel really strongly that there are too many young men in this country who are dealing with a crisis of loneliness, really struggling in lots of different ways, and don't have enough people and places that they can go, talk about it, get help, and enough wraparound support when they do ask for help. And so we're absolutely determined to change that. And the reason that I'm here talking to you today is because in my town, Wigan, sport is the glue that holds those things together. It's often the place that young men and women go for support and camaraderie and a sense of belonging and friendship. It's often the place where they open up for the first time. And so as a government, we have decided to work with lots of different sporting bodies to really step up the amount of support and help that's around for young men.
And what will that look like on the ground?
Lots of different things, because for us this is about being driven by young men to deliver what they need in their own local community. One of the things that we've already done is announce new funding for a charity called Rugby League Cares. Rugby League is a sport that is more like a family and a religion in towns like Wigan and many of the coalfield communities across the north of England, and it can reach places that others can't. We're doing 2 pilot projects, one in Wigan and one in Wakefield, where they're, through the funding that we've announced, able to support many more young men, give them a space to come into the local community clubs, be able to get involved in activities and make friends and get to know people without that sense of stigma that comes from going to a mental health service. You know, you go back to see your mates and they say, where have you been? You say, I've been at the rugby club. You don't have to say, I've been seeking professional help for my mental health crisis. And they're already really skilled and experienced in doing this. So we're seeing if by providing additional funding for programmes specifically aimed at supporting young men, that we'll be able to make a difference. And if we can, our intention is to roll that out across the country. That's one thing we've done already. We've got lots more to come.
And how will that work with the football? Is that more community-based as well?
So one of the first things that I did as the Secretary of State when I took responsibility for sport was to convene a round table of lots of different groups. Premier League were involved, the EFL, as well as from across Rugby League, Rugby Union, many other sports besides. And I was overwhelmed by the response from those sporting bodies who wanted to get involved to better support young men. They see it for themselves so often. They see it with ex-players who, you know, when you listen to ex-players, when they've left the sport, often that what they're talking about is not missing, you know, the scoring of goals and the crowd cheering them on. What they're talking about really missing is that sense of camaraderie, that, you know, that friendship, that the vibe in the changing room, and, you know, the social scene that goes alongside it. And so they really get it. And a lot of young men in this country, of course, you know, they don't look up to politicians as their role models, but they do look at some of the best sporting stars in the country, and through delivering better messages through those sporting stars about, you know, everyone struggles with their mental health, everyone needs some help sometime, and our clubs are the place where you can come and get that friendship, get that support, get whatever help you need. And we're here not just for the short term, like a lot of government interventions, but we're here for the long term as well. We think we can reach more people, and it was great to have the Premier League, the EFL and others involved who are doing their own work to try and provide better support. They've identified coaches as one of the key places where that relationship with young men is forged. And so we're working with them to see what we can do to provide better training and support for coaches, so that as well as being great sports coaches, they can also do more to support young men with mental health. You know, often the coach is the person that you would open up to rather than a teacher or a family member. it might be your coach who's the most important person and role model in your life. So we're looking at what we can do as a government to package more help and support around them so they can better support young people. For a long time, what you've had is young men have been told, go and see a mental health professional, go through the CAMS system, which we know has serious challenges, go and talk to your teacher, go and talk to an adult in a job that we've designated is going to be there for you. But actually the reality in most young men's lives is that there's already somebody that they really trust, that is that lifeline, that really important relationship. So we're taking a new approach as a government and saying, if it's your sports coach that you most trust, then we'll make sure that they've got the tools that they need to help and support you when you ask for help and when you approach them, not force you to go off and speak to somebody who you've never met, who you don't know, who'll be there for a matter of weeks, not in it for the long term.
So it's a separation of church and state, really, then. I want to pick you up on that a little bit, because one of the biggest complaints that we do get from men who write into Joe is that when they do reach out for medical help, whether that be talking therapies, whether that be through the CAM system, often it is delayed. And a lot of the time they'll get their initial meeting and then they'll be waiting 90 days for a second meeting, and their health can deteriorate during that time. So what's going to be funded there, or what help can you provide to bridge that gap?
Well, we've just published a health strategy that is led by my friend Wes Streeting at the Department of Health that's designed to deal with that. That's not just for young men and boys, that's also for women and girls as well, who have real challenges in accessing the mental health support that they need when they need it. Young people tell us often that when they most need someone to speak to is not Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. It's often at 10 o'clock at night on a Saturday, and yet those services aren't built around what they would need. They're built around the way that services often work. We think that's wrong, and that's got to change. And then 6 weeks is never going to be long enough for anybody to be able to get the real help that they need, which is why we're looking at these partnerships with sporting bodies and others, so that the service that you're able to access is there for the long term, that there's somebody who can hang on to you for much longer than the short-term crisis, and that you can get help much more quickly. So one of the things that Wes said to me the other day, who's our health secretary, is that you wouldn't normally go to the doctor and say, I've got a health condition, and they'd say, wait until it's a crisis point before you can get an operation, or you can get treatment for your physical health problems. But too often that is the experience for people with mental health problems. And so we're trying to turn that around. We've put a lot of funding into the National Health Service in order to do that. We've got this new strategy that we've been working on across government. I think the thing that's different this time is not only that we're putting the funding in, but also that we're genuinely looking at what every bit of government can do to turn this around. I don't think the Department for Health can do it on its own, and nor should they, which is why we're stepping up and we're doing our bit.
And what about if you go to your coach, and you say to them, it's because I don't have a house, I can't pay my rent, I've got financial trouble. A lot of the rhetoric from government at this point in time is 16 to 24-year-olds just simply aren't working and they need to get back to work. If work doesn't pay, do you think you can ever solve one of the main factors of the mental health crisis?
I think it's all rolled in together. So it's the picture that we're getting from young people is that there aren't enough places to go where they feel safe, where they can be with friends or form friendships, where they can talk to adults that they trust. A lot of them don't have the adults that they trust. They don't have the opportunities that they want in their lives. And even where they are really driven and have a really strong sense of what they want to achieve in life, so often it's those things. It's inadequate housing, it's poor public transport, it's just genuinely the cost of being able to do any of those things, to access any of those things, worrying about money all the time, that is holding them back. We can't solve all of that through one focus on men and health, but what we can do is really try and grip the challenges facing this generation of young people. So when I was first appointed as Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport last summer, one of the first things that we did was to get a group of young people together, drawn from every part of the country, lots of different backgrounds, young people leaving care, young people who've been struggling with challenges of gang violence and other things. We brought them together and we said to them, this country hasn't had a strategy for its young people for over 2 decades. We want you to write one. They went out and had the biggest conversation that government's had for years with young people across the country, and they've written us a national youth strategy. We've found some money for it, and we've put a decent chunk of money behind that, and we're about to launch that in the next few weeks. That looks at all of those things, including the very real challenge that you were just talking about, which is that for all young people, there are some serious challenges that have gone unaddressed. For some young people, they're far, far more acute because they lack the money, the housing, the transport, all of those things that other people take for granted that are holding them back.
And what do you say to the young men who might be turning to reform during this time? You know, that party has seen a huge uptick in membership, particularly from under 30s. And the main reason they do cite is poor mental health, based off of the fact they can't afford anything. What do you say to those young men?
So we want every young person in this country to live the life that they want to live. And for a long time, that has just not been the case. I think young people in particular, they bore the brunt not just of the global pandemic, but also of the 10 years of austerity and degradation of youth services that came before it. If you think about what we saw happen to young people, they lost things like the education maintenance allowance and aim higher, careers advice was removed from schools. You saw all of the challenges of the decisions that were made in government so that those with the broadest shoulders didn't bear the greatest burden during the financial crash. And a lot of young people were growing up in families where the sort of poverty that had almost been eradicated under the last Labour government had returned with a vengeance, and youth services in particular, which were a lifeline for a lot of young people, bore the biggest brunt. 73% cuts across the country to council-run youth services under the last government. We're determined that that's going to change. It's why we've got this national youth strategy that's been written by, with and for young people, and why we're investing to make sure that this generation has the chances that they need to succeed. And I agree with you that a lot of young men are turning to some quite unsavoury people and things that they see on the internet, and people who promise cheap solutions to really difficult problems that people face in their lives. But I think often that's because it feels like there isn't any hope. We will know that we've succeeded as a government where young people, young men across this country feel a real sense of hope and optimism for the future. We know that they're the most as ambitious a generation as any other before them, for themselves, their families, their communities and their country, but the opportunities just haven't been there, and that's what we're determined we're going to turn around.
Just finally, I wanted to ask you about gambling, because you know, when young people find themselves in difficult circumstances, they do turn to gambling, particularly betting shops that might be on high streets. What are you going to do are you planning to rid our high streets of that scourge, or is it something you feel that young people can live alongside?
Look, gambling brings a lot of joy to a lot of people, but for a significant minority, it can cause an enormous amount of harm. And for young men in particular, there's a real draw towards gambling that can wreck lives, and we recognise that as a government. We've implemented a new gambling levy, which is making sure that the most harmful forms of gambling, it's often the online forms of gambling rather than betting shops on high streets and others, that they pay the most towards supporting young people who get pulled into harmful and problematic gambling and preventing that from happening in the first place. And so that money is being spent on treatment for people who do suffer those consequences, but it's also a lot of that money is being spent on preventing gambling from becoming a harmful addiction in the first place. We don't want to stop people living the lives that they want to live. We don't want to stop people being able to have a good time. But what we do want to make sure is that where you've got harmful forms of gambling that are causing a real problem for individuals, that we're there and we're stepping up and we're making sure that we treat that when it occurs, but most of all that we prevent young men from being pulled into that in the first place.